I want to welcome everybody here today who's here from the media, everybody that's here in person, and we also have a number of folks in the media across the country who are joined on the telephone. We're also fortunate to have some people here today that are members of a group that we're very active in called the One Voice Against Cancer, where we have 40 national nonprofit organizations that work together to try to urge the Congress to appropriate an appropriate amount of money for cancer research and other cancer prevention programs. What's going on right now in the budget is critically important to our fight against cancer. The funding matters. I think you're going to hear some today about the kinds of things that come out of this research and our concern about not having the appropriate amount of money for the research. The other thing is, I think it's significant to note that the public strongly disapproves of reducing the amount of money that we're spending on cancer research along the lines of what's being proposed in the House of Representatives right now in an appropriations bill. So what we're going to do today, the people that are joining us, Dr. Seffrin, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Cancer Society and the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, Lance Armstrong, who is a cancer survivor and founder and chairman of LIVESTRONG, and I'm sure you all know who he is, Dr. Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institutes of Health, and Tracy Elliman, who is a former National Cancer Institute clinical trial participant. So I'd like to turn it over, first of all, to Dr. Seffrin, who is our CEO. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to be joined today by my colleague in cancer control and good friend, Lance Armstrong, the esteemed Dr. Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, the largest biomedical research institute in the entire world, and Tracy, who will tell you her story in just a few minutes. We're here today at a time of enormous opportunity, unprecedented, an historic time when great advances are virtually imminent. Scientific advances have resulted in new and better ways to prevent cancer, detect cancer, treat cancer, resulting in the fact that we're now saving 350 more lives per day, every day, each day than we were in 1991. Not only is that something to celebrate and rejoice in and to understand that there's 760,000 Americans who will celebrate a birthday this year who wouldn't otherwise if the death rates had stayed the same as they were in 1991. However, it's a time for concern. Federal funding for medical research and cancer prevention programs have had a role in every major advance against the disease that Americans most care about, namely cancer. This funding is also responsible for unlocking the human genome, as no one knows better than Francis Collins, which has dramatically increased our understanding of cancer and the genetic factors surrounding the disease process, but also opening the black box of how to find answers to the various problems attendant to the myriad diseases that we know of as cancer. Past federal investments have also put us on the verge of making groundbreaking new discoveries that could accelerate our progress and lead to treatments for some of the most deadly cancers. We could be looking at, if we sustain our support of biomedical research and prevention activities, of taking that 350 lives to 1,000 lives a day in this nation, paving the way to bringing cancer under control earlier in this new 21st century. But instead of seizing this opportunity to further our progress against cancer, Congress is considering a proposal that would mark a major setback in the fight against cancer. The FY11 funding bill passed by the House of Representatives would cut the National Institutes of Health budget by 5.2% and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention budget by 21%. This is not acceptable. This will cause lives to be lost. These cuts could be devastating to the nation's fight against cancer. Cuts of this magnitude could result in the following kinds of outcomes. 1/3 of all phase 3 clinical trials on cancer could be eliminated. You'll soon hear about what happens when clinical trials are eliminated. The National Cancer Institute would fund 60% fewer new and competing research grants than they did last year. An important study looking at the long-term effects of CT scans on pediatric patients could be curtailed. A valuable research program focusing on the relationship between obesity and cancer could be summarily eliminated. Cuts at the CDC would result in fewer people receiving the life-saving screening tests that they need. A 10% cut in the National Breast and Cervical Cancer Detection Program would result in 40,000 fewer underserved women being screened. An 11% cut in the colorectal cancer control program could result in 3 out of the 25 state screening programs being just simply eliminated. Obviously, then, early disease not being detected, late disease causing premature death. Few people would argue that the overall federal spending should not be reduced. But cutting funding for cancer research and prevention programs is the wrong way to do it. Nearly 85% of the federal funding for NIH is spent on research projects at local research facilities across our great nation. According to NIH, a total of more than $22 billion went to nearly 53,000 research grants in every state in the union and virtually every congressional district across the country last year. These grants are not only enhancing our understanding of cancer and what to do about it, but they represent an investment in our economy by creating jobs at academic institutions and in businesses. The public understands the crucial value of federal cancer funding. A new poll commissioned by the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network that we are releasing here today finds that more than 3/4 of the public opposes cutting funding for cancer research and prevention programs as part of the effort to reduce federal spending. And what is interesting, and as the data will show all of you in your press packets, they not only oppose it, but the plurality of the 77%, 40 of that percent, strongly oppose it. The opposition is strong among people who identify themselves as Democrats, people who identify themselves as Republicans, and people who identify themselves as independents. 8 out of 10 respondents oppose cutting cancer funding when informed that 40,000 fewer women would not get the recommended breast and cervical cancer screenings they need. 8 out of 10 oppose it when they learn that cuts would mean 1/3 fewer federally funded cancer clinical trials that are in the last phase of research. And 8 out of 10 oppose it when they know that cuts would mean less research to develop diagnostic tools for the cancers currently lacking accurate screening tests. We call on Congress to sustain the federal investment in cancer research and prevention programs so that progress can continue unabated against this disease that will strike 1 in every 2 men, every other man, and 1 in 3 women in their lifetime. And now it is my privilege and pleasure to call on my colleague in cancer control, the personification of the hopeful side of cancer, and one of the world's greatest leaders in cancer control, Lance Armstrong. Lance?
Well, I can't, Dr. Seffrin did a great job of really summarizing our country's attitude towards not only the disease, but the possibility of potentially cutting back in this war. And, you know, I stand here, like Tracy will stand here, as somebody that has been in these trenches. This is very personal for me. This is, although it's been quite some time and I don't ever want to go through it again, it was still a very special experience for me. But this is not, while it's a personal experience for us, sometimes in D.C., this could almost be viewed as a political issue for some. This isn't a political issue. The disease doesn't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, a Tea Partier, right in the middle. It doesn't care where you are. It doesn't care if you're black or white, speak English or Spanish. The disease comes when you least expect it, and it affects not just yourself, but everybody around you, your friends, your family, your schools, your workplaces. And we're at an interesting time, and I'm sure that the doctors and the researchers here can speak to it much better than I, but now is not the time to back down. And I think that if you collected the brightest people in this country and put them in one room, they would tell you that now is the time we actually need to accelerate things. I'm personally very optimistic because we now, at the NCI, we have Dr. Varmus, who's now the head of the NCI, is an old friend of ours who's been an amazing soldier in this fight, somebody who's a Nobel laureate, somebody who's really seen up close and personal the devastating effect that this disease has. So the numbers speak for themselves. And Dr. Seffrin and I were just doing an interview, and the gentleman asked us, he said, what would you say to the American people or to our leaders of why we shouldn't cut back or why we need to increase funding? I said, it's very simple. 600,000 deaths a year. I can't say that any clearer. I can't be any more direct. 1,500 Americans every day lose their lives to this disease. Imagine if that was something that we didn't know about yesterday and came along today and all of a sudden just started clicking off 1,500 Americans every single day. We would not be cutting back. That wouldn't be an issue. In fact, we would be doubling and tripling and quadrupling our efforts. And so it is an appeal, and I hope it's not a desperate appeal, because I look forward to getting the good news that Congress will make the right decision here. But we are in this for the long haul. This is a very complicated disease. Let's not, in the same interview, I used the analogy of myself standing here today or sitting there in that interview, standing here in front of you all. Meanwhile, my good friend Elizabeth Edwards is not here. She's not here because her disease is so very different. Breast cancer, very different, diagnosed differently, treated differently. And unfortunately, sometimes the outcome is different. So we got to be realistic that we have picked a nasty one to fight, and one that's not so easy to figure out. 40 years ago, Richard Nixon declared war on cancer, and we also talked about that in that interview, he started the National Cancer Institute that year and funded it with $150 million. And to look back on those 40 years, we've had some amazing success stories, but we just have a long ways to go. And finally, two more things. I think the critical thing here is when you hear these numbers, and Dr. Seffrin talks about the numbers, the devastating effect of it, you realize, at least I do, and I think most people do, and I mean the American people, if 75% of the people say, regardless of their political slant, say we don't support cutting cancer research, it's because it's a moral and ethical issue. When people are dying, and even the remote thought that by cutting back will lead to more deaths, well, that's very simple. That's a moral and ethical equation, and we can't make the wrong decision there. And then finally, I say it all the time with regards to my own foundation. I'm sure that you guys talk about this too, but we always speak in terms of how our efforts are doing in fundraising. So if it's how they were going at the Lance Armstrong Foundation or at ACS, hey, we had a great year. We raised more money than we raised last year. It's very easy to say it was a great year because you raised more money. When Congress does the right thing and actually fulfills this funding, it's going to be easy for us to say it was great. That was a great thing. But the only time that we can truly step back and say it was great is the day that nobody needs Dr. Seffrin, nobody needs the Lance Armstrong Foundation, nobody needs Livestrong, nobody needs Tracy to stand up here and tell her story, because we've solved the problem. That's the day that we get to say, things are great. It's not about funding anymore. It's not about what the people think or what they want or don't want. It's history. And that's the day that really we all get to stand up and say, this is a great day. And so we got to make the right decisions in order to get to that day. And that's why we're here today to sort of share our story and share our passion, and hopefully we get things done. So thank you.
Thank you. Lance, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts, and thank you also for all that you do to try to end the ravages of cancer every day. So we really appreciate what you're doing. We're also privileged today to be joined by Tracy Elliman of Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. Tracy is a former National Cancer Institute clinical trial participant and has a very powerful story to tell about her multi-generational fight against cancer and the impact that research has had on that. Tracy, thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm excited to be here, but I'm with Lance. I'd rather not be here, and I hope that I have a 3-generational story to tell, and I hope that I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old son, and that they won't be here with Dr. Seffrin 10 years from now telling their story. So I wanted to talk about that everything you just heard from Dr. Seffrin and from Lance Armstrong and that you'll hear from Dr. Collins really does boil down to stories like ours and stories like mine. I had my grandmother was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1977. And in Wilmington, Delaware in 1977, you didn't say the word breast out loud. You really didn't talk about cancer. It was sort of, is it contagious? Is it not contagious? What is it? You certainly did not have an international athlete have testicular cancer and talk about it. So things have come a long way. But back then, there was nothing for her to do. Chemo and radiation wasn't an option until there was a reoccurrence. Her reoccurrence came in about 2 years, and she never made the magical 5-year mark that we have now. When my grandmother was dying, I was 10, and my mom came home and said, I don't want to alarm you, but I have what Mom has. And all I know is that Mom had just died. And here I had my beautiful mom at 38 years old have stage 3 breast cancer with 11 out of 13 lymph nodes being positive. I certainly didn't know what that meant then. I know what that means now. And my mom's oncologist enrolled her in a clinical trial through the National Cancer Institute. I think it's through a NYU study funded by NCI. And she will tell you that that saved her life. She's not with us today because she's in St. John's. And I'm thrilled to say that she is there on vacation. She did have a reoccurrence 8 years later in 1990 of a different type of breast cancer in her other breast. She went through another clinical trial, and again, she's here to tell about that. She would have told you that she wasn't sure she would see me get married, let alone have grandchildren, and she did. She saw me do all those things and have all those things. I was asked what I remember about that time, and I really don't remember a whole bunch. She was a trooper through it, but I do remember the stories of how the only reason why she's here is because clinical trials saved her life. And the information that she probably gave back to those clinical trials have helped others. So then we come down to my story, and NIH and through federally funded research decoded the human genome. And then I got a call that said, well, if you want to find out if you are BRCA, if you might have a mutation to put you in this certain group, there's a test for that. Which I decided it was time. I was 38 years old. I was the age my mother was when she was diagnosed, and I just didn't want to, I wanted to know what my options were. So I went to a genetic counselor. I'm BRCA1 positive, and she told me that I should enroll in a clinical trial at NIH, and I did it right away. That trial was supposed to be 5 years, and it was 4. And I was told one day at the end of my 4th year that, you know, the funding then, back in 2008, went flat, and it had been cut for several years, so the trial was over. But my first question was, great, you found out the answer of what we needed to do? And she said, no, we're out of money. And I kind of said, now what? So my only options were to kind of sit and wait and see what happens, or get a prophylactic mastectomy and oophorectomy, which is your ovaries, because with BRCA1, you also have an increased chance of ovarian cancer. So I did those things. I'm thrilled I did them, and I did it with the guidance of NIH and all the information that they had gained from clinical trials at that point. As a parent, my daughter and son would say, well, Mommy, do we have to do what you did? And I said, I hope not. And I'd like to not lie to them. I want to tell them, no, you're not going to have to, because they're going to find answers and everything's going to be okay. And I don't want to lie to them, and I really want that to be the truth. And I was just going to finish up with, I had listened to a talk by Allison Levine a few weeks ago, and she was the woman who headed the Everest, all-women's Everest expedition. And she was an amazing speaker, and one of the things that she was talking about being up on the mountain that kills is complacency. And, she just said, complacency will kill us. And I thought, that translates to today, it translates to what we're talking about today. And if we are complacent on this funding, if we don't do anything, if we cut it, and if we don't do anything, complacency is going to kill us. And I really hope, Congress listens to what's going on this week, listens to these numbers from Dr. Seffrin, from Lance Armstrong and LiveStrong Foundation, from Dr. Collins, and everybody who has these obvious numbers, that they're listened to, and that Congress isn't complacent. Thank you.
Tracy, thank you very much for sharing that story and those thoughts. They're important. And now, lastly, it's an honor to welcome Dr. Francis Collins, who is the director of the NIH. He is the nation's top federal medical research official, and he is a tireless advocate for public health. Dr. Collins, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's a privilege to be part of this press event, and I bring greetings to everybody from Harold Varmus, who would be here himself, except he is off at a medical meeting trying to solve the problems of cancer. It's one of my greatest achievements since I arrived as the NIH director a year and a half ago, was to recruit Harold Varmus to come back to the NIH. I used to report to him, now he reports to me. It's sort of a crossover trial. We can decide later how it turned out, but it's great having Harold with all of his brilliance and his insight and his vision. And I spoke to him yesterday about being here, and certainly got his sense as well about how important it is for the message right now to be received about the scientific opportunities, which are truly unprecedented, and our ability to understand the causes of cancer and how to prevent and treat this disease. So I'm here to talk about the science. The public investment in cancer research has brought us to a very exciting place. I could talk about a number of aspects of that in terms of prevention, new ideas about screening. You probably saw this exciting results about perhaps ways to save lives for smokers in terms of lung cancer using low-dose helical CT. I could talk about those kinds of new imaging approaches. I could talk about many new ideas about small molecule therapies or biologics. But in the limited time, I'm going to focus on just one area because it is central to our ability to unravel the mystery of cancer. Because cancer is a disease of DNA. It's a disease of the genome, something I know a little bit about. And the genome is, of course, the instruction book for all organisms, and every one of your cells has that instruction book. And it's a good thing, because otherwise the cell wouldn't know what to do. But glitches in that instruction book, mutations, are capable of causing a good cell to go bad. And we have known that, actually, for a couple of decades, somewhat through the work of Harold Varmus, in fact, but we've not had the complete comprehensive understanding of all of the things in the genome that are capable of causing that malignant behavior to emerge. We are there now with the technologies to be able to do that. We no longer have to limit ourselves to looking under the lamppost to find the answers. And that's because we have the technologies that can take a cancer cell and find out everything that is contributing to that malignant behavior. And we're doing that. The Cancer Genome Atlas, which is a joint effort of the Cancer Institute and the Genome Institute, and is working very effectively with an international community that's also very jazzed about taking part in this, is accelerating the pace of getting those answers at a prodigious rate. After all, at the beginning of TCGA, as it's called, it took a year to sequence 600 genes in 91 tumor samples, and that happened to be the most scary form of brain tumor, glioblastoma multiforme. That resulted in great important insights into the disease that took the life of my friend, Senator Ted Kennedy, and many others. And we are already now harvesting those in terms of better diagnostics and new ideas about therapy. But remember what I just said, 600 genes in 91 tumor samples, that was 2 years ago. This year, in fact, this month, we're going to sequence 20,000 genes in 250 tumors. The pace of acceleration of the ability to collect that information is breathtaking. And we are in the process now of expanding that to the 20 most common cancers with a clear intention of taking the complete landscape in front of us and moving that forward then to the next ideas in terms of diagnostics and therapeutics. And already, insights coming out of that are breathtaking. Recent work by researchers at Washington University in St. Louis on acute myeloid leukemia identified a particular gene mutation that pops up repeatedly and could well be a good clue to the development of new therapy. Today's issue of Nature includes a paper describing a cancer genomics approach to multiple myeloma, a very, very frightening kind of blood cancer, which is usually fatal. Also revealing a number of surprises, including the fact that in that collection of patients with myeloma are something like 5% of them who would probably respond quite effectively to a drug developed for another purpose, but you wouldn't have known that without looking intensively at their cancer genomes. We have advances in lung cancer, advances in ovarian cancer, which are coming soon because the Cancer Genome Atlas is about to reveal what they have learned from studying a very large number of ovarian cancers, including some therapeutic implications. So this is, for me as a scientist and for all of those working in cancer research, an unprecedented time of opportunity. But that opportunity is going to need investments in order to be capitalized on. This is not an overnight experience to go from having that fundamental information to developing the next round of truly effective targeted therapies. We expect that in the future, almost every cancer will need to have this same analysis done as part of the management. You will want to know exactly what's driving the cancer in that person, and then you will choose from a much longer list of therapies than what we have now, those that are most likely to be active in that individual, a truly personalized approach. But that's going to take a lot of basic science and a lot of clinical trials. And so the future of this really depends upon the strong support that has been there as a bipartisan effort over the years, in which we very much hope will continue. Because this is a long road. Science is not something that happens in 1-year cycles or 2-year cycles. It's not a 100-yard dash, it's a marathon. Or maybe, Lance, it's not a quick straightaway. It's a Tour de France victory that we're aiming for here. And that means putting the investment into building up the teams that are necessary to make that happen. Societies, I think, decide how to invest their resources in the things that matter. Societies will be judged by whether or not those resources are considered to be particularly appropriate for those who need help. And as we have heard, in a circumstance like today, where the equivalent of 5 jumbo jets are crashing every day with all on board dying, that's what the toll is from cancer right now. To have the opportunity to be able to change that, and not to move forward with the most ambitious, energetic, visionary approaches that science is now capable of, would be truly a lost opportunity. So I'm glad to be part of this and to have a chance to say just a few words about the science, and I thank the American Chemical Society. Turn off the camera. Thank the American Cancer Society and the LiveStrong Foundation. And thank you, Tracy, for telling your very powerful story. Research cures cancer. Let's make sure research can happen. Thank you.
Dr. Collins, thank you very much. We now have some time for questions. If people have them, what we're going to do is we have people on the telephone, and we'll take a few questions from the room here if anybody has them, and then we'll see if we have any on the phone. Yes.
Yes, I'm Peggy Eastman from Oncology Times newspaper. My first question is, this is a House of Representatives bill, and just from where I sit, I'm not sure how this would do in the Senate. I don't think particularly well, from what I know of the Senate, nor would the president sign it if it got to his desk, from what I know of President Obama. So I'm just wondering how much of a real threat this particular House of Representatives bill is. That's the first question. And the second one is for Dr. Collins. As you know, Dr. Collins, the National Cancer Institute is now revamping its cancer clinical trials program. And the Institute of Medicine has made specific recommendations on how that should be done. So I'm interested in knowing how budget cuts, should they occur, would affect that reinvigoration and reorganization of the cancer clinical trial system, the cooperative group system particularly.
Maybe what we could do is answer that second question first about the, what would happen to the clinical trial system, Dr.
Right.
Collins?
So as you referred to, the Institute of Medicine, at NCI's request, reviewed the NCI clinical trials program and made a number of observations and recommendations about ways to revamp this. And Harold Varmus has taken this on as one of his highest priorities and has recently announced some changes of a very significant sort to try to speed up the ability to make the necessary changes. And that includes making sure that trials are established in a way that they can enroll participants in a short enough period of time, which has been in the past sometimes a problem. Obviously, many issues that need to be dealt with in terms of getting appropriate human subjects approvals in a timely fashion. I don't think we have time here to go through all the details of that, but I think they've been well clarified by Harold and colleagues. What would the impact be? Well, as you heard, basically, were we to see the kind of diminished support for NCI and NIH that's proposed in H.R. 1, because, remember, NIH funds grants on a multi-year process, so it is particularly painful for us to see a cut happen of a large sort in the middle of the year where we have other commitments that we have made. So anything that is not absolutely committed to then becomes vulnerable. And as you heard, probably something in the neighborhood of a third of NCI clinical trials would be stopped in terms of any more enrollment for the remainder of the year.
And let me go back to your first question, which was really about the, how serious the threat is to the funding in the Congress, given the fact that the Senate and the White House are unlikely to agree with what the House is proposing. And I guess I'd like to try to answer that one and offer anybody else who would like to augment what I say, please. I think in a normal year, if we didn't have a debt ceiling issue, I think that what would happen is that the Senate wouldn't go along with the House, and you'd wind up having to do something between the Senate and the House to work out a number, knowing that there was some additional leverage that the White House would have in that process because they have a veto pen if the cut is too large. I think that the federal debt ceiling really confuses that greatly, because there are a lot of other things that can happen here, because if you don't reach an agreement, you can basically shut down the government. There are a lot of things that are apt to happen. So I think it makes the whole situation very, very unpredictable right now, and that worries us. I would also add that I think there's another principle here, that it's not just about the funding this year, as critically important as that is. It's also about people understanding, when we go through a period of time when people are dealing with a federal deficit, and they're trying to reorder priorities, and they're trying to understand why certain things should be priorities. I think it's just as important to us that people understand why cancer research funding needs to be a national priority in this country. Yes.
In this environment, you have a real hard sell on Capitol Hill. And even though President Nixon declared war on cancer decades ago, there's still possibly at that point there might have been 6 jumbo airliners crashing, and now there's 5. But I think skeptics can argue there hasn't been a huge amount of progress made in these decades. How do you persuade Congress that federal investment is the way to go, and that cancer is more worthy of it than other areas of biomedical research or of discretionary spending?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. The question basically for the people on the phone is, how do you convince people that this really should be a priority for domestic discretionary spending? I don't know, Dr. Collins, would you like to?
Sure. I mean, the declaration of the war on cancer was a milestone, to be sure, because it brought attention to a disease that, as we have heard from Tracy, was a disease people were even reluctant to talk about. and brought this out into an area that needed research but also needed public engagement and made that possible. But in 1971, we didn't have the tools or the insights to be able to understand what was driving the cancer cell to become malignant at all. It was a noble enterprise at a time where the foundational information was out of reach. The foundational information is now in our hands. We are light years ahead of where we would have been had it not been for the insights of the last decade. And this puts us in a position, although we have to be careful not to overpromise about the timetable, but it is possible now to map a position from where we are now to where we want to be in terms of being able to prevent, to diagnose, and to cure cancer. And we shouldn't be shy to say that, that this is not 1971. And I think any enterprise of this magnitude is going to be one where you could say, well, you've worked on it for a little while and you haven't succeeded yet. Well, that's why you need to keep working on it. And again, I think if people are willing to look at the evidence, look at the case, look at where science has gotten us, you can't help but be excited because we can see the path now.
I would just like to add a quick comment to that, because I think any suggestion that the progress that's been made is very modest is patently wrong. When you've got 767,000 Americans having a birthday this year who wouldn't have otherwise if the death rates had stayed the same as 1991 is proof positive that we're making progress.
Indeed.
And once we've done that, that's all the more the moral imperative to take it to the next level, 1,000 lives a day. Let me put a finer point on it, because as Dr. Collins mentioned, this doesn't happen overnight. But when our organization got started in 1913, any diagnosis of cancer was a virtual death sentence, only to be preceded by a protracted period of pain and suffering. When the American Cancer Society made a major commitment to cancer research in 1946, most still died, but about 1 in 3 survived. Today, most people who get diagnosed with cancer in this country survive, and some even thrive. So there's no question but what we can talk about, not what year, but earlier in this century, bringing this under control is a major public health problem. Most of the people in America today who get diagnosed with cancer didn't need to have gotten diagnosed with cancer, because 60% of all cancer is now preventable during a normal human lifespan. Most of the people who suffer from cancer today are suffering needlessly because they're not getting the care that they need. Most of the people who die today, the 1,500, didn't need to die. When I got involved in this work 4 decades ago, you couldn't say that, but we can say it today. So we don't have all the answers. That's why we need to sustain research. But I can guarantee you, even though we've had 15 successive years of decline in age-standardized cancer mortality rates, it doesn't have to continue that way. It can go the other direction, particularly in an aging society. So it is absolutely imperative. And Peggy, to your point, you damn right we take it seriously about the House passing a 5.2% decrease, because that makes a statement. At some point in time, this country will have a budget. Agreed? And in that budget, there will be priorities. And one of those priorities should be health and biomedical research.
We've got a question here and then one over here.
Yeah, a question for Mr. Armstrong. You talked about accelerating the federal spending on health research, maybe even tripling or doubling it. The White House has data that shows that federal spending on health research and training more than doubled in the past decade, from $15.9 billion in 2000 to $36.1 billion this year. And when the U.S. faces a $14 trillion debt, and we've already seen these massive spending increases in the past, are you saying that even a little bit of a cut is unacceptable?
Yeah, I actually.
Please identify yourself.
Sure, it's Nicholas Ballasy with CNS News.
Well, I was referring to a hypothetical disease that came along overnight that all of a sudden started killing 1,500 Americans every day. We would see funding out of nowhere that would, that would diminish anything we're talking about today. But unfortunately, like Tracy said, I mean, I think, so I'm not. That wasn't what I wasn't suggesting that instead of cutting things by 5%, we should double or triple or quadruple it. That was a sort of a fictitious disease in terms of how our country would panic if something like that came along. But as Tracy touched on, and as I mentioned, 40 years is a long time. And you ask a fair question. Do you say, okay, what have we done in 40 years? But again, Tracy talked about complacency, and I think we have gotten ourselves to this place where. And we hear these stories. Our organizations hear these stories where somebody says, I mean, listen, I lost my grandmother last week to lung cancer, 85 years old, 84 years old. She lived a great life, and she didn't want to fight and go through chemotherapy and end her life in pain like that. But you could argue that she should have lived to 100. Or, people come along and say, oh, Grandpa died at 75 of prostate cancer. He had a great life. I'd say BS. I mean, the guy could have lived to be 95, and he could have seen 10 more grandkids and seen some graduations and gone on a few more vacations. So we've gotten to this point where it's almost, I don't want to say it's acceptable, but it's certainly not front page news. If those jumbo liners did start falling out of the sky, trust me, it would be front page news every day of every week, of every month, of every year. And so we have to be, Tracy, you said it perfectly. I mean, we got to be very careful with our country's approach to this, or our country's tolerance to this disease, because I mean, I think you just heard it in Dr. Seffrin's voice. There's a man who does not have any tolerance for what we're faced with.
Dr. Collins?
Just a quick clarification about the facts of the budget support. If you look at the NIH budget over the course of the last 15 years, and you factor into that the way in which inflation has eaten away at purchasing power, something called the Biomedical Research and Development Price Index, which has the unfortunate acronym that we sometimes pronounce bird pie. So bird pie runs about 3.5% a year. So if you look at the numbers, basically, the funds available to NIH in FY10, the last year for which we had a definite year-long budget, were about the same as they were in 2001. So we have basically gained no ground in those 9 years as far as what we can actually do.
Yes.
Hi, Brett Coughlin with Politico. Is this not on?
I think it is.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. I just wanted to ask about rhetoric for a second. You may have heard that the Republicans don't like the health care reform bill. And Steve King from Iowa made this statement, and as a cancer survivor, I'd like to ask you and you about this rhetoric. He was referring to the Obama administration. He said, they're like Santa's elves in there 24/7, energetically implementing Obamacare to get it in place so they can expand this dependency class in America and get the roots of that malignant tumor down so deep that we can't get a hold of it and pull it out. As cancer survivors, what's your reaction to that sort of rhetoric?
That's a poor choice of words, I think. Certainly, I'm sure he would admit that, I hope. We were speaking with one of your colleagues earlier, Dr. Seffrin and I, talking about the healthcare initiative, and our organization supported that simply because of the perspective that we viewed it with regards to being cancer survivors or cancer fighting organizations. It was simply too significant and too important, and the impact too great on the lives of people that are either dealing with the disease or surviving the disease, or trying to get insurance obviously with a pre-existing condition, or as Dr. Seffrin pointed out in the piece about not having a cap on something that can be a very expensive journey. I mean, thinking back on my issue in the mid-'90s, hundreds of thousands of dollars. You start to include other things, bone marrow transplants and multiple surgeries can be into the millions. So that cap was really critical. But that's just a very sensitive political issue, and so I always try to take our disease out of that, because it's not. And I don't know the senator or the congressman from Iowa, although I have done RAGBRAI a few times. But that would be a very bad choice of words, I would say.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not a slip of the tongue. He's repeated it. He said it on the House floor. He says it in interviews over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered if you had any response to it either, Ms. Allen.
I would say it sounded so full of rhetoric that I don't even know what it means. Lance just said it. It doesn't make any sense. And if this is a disease that affects all of us, and it's going to affect somebody he knows, somebody he loves, somebody that he loves, it's ridiculous, and it kind of I wouldn't even respond to that.
Maybe somebody on the staff, maybe there must be some sports analogy or something we can replace it with for his own sake. I mean, or, well, yeah.
I'll send him the article.
But it probably tries to capitalize on the fact that he knows that cancer is the most feared disease by the American public. And when asked year after year by the Gallup organization what health concerns you most for yourself and your family, people repeatedly say cancer. And so then using the word malignant tumor is a way, and associating that with healthcare reform is a way of marginalizing the importance of that. When in fact, the law of the land, which is not perfect, does provide us with an opportunity to build out a healthcare system that is truly a healthcare system, the centerpiece of which can be prevention and health promotion and access to care when you need it for everyone when they need it. Nothing is more important to a person facing cancer.
And to follow up on that, sorry, is, when you ask those people, what is your greatest fear, your greatest health-related fear, they say cancer. When you then follow up and ask them, what are the chances that you get cancer? 1% say yes, 1%. And so therein lies the problem with prevention because, of course, I'm almost 40, so I don't feel invincible anymore, but at one point I did feel invincible. And so that then becomes, as Dr. Seffrin just said, sort of the issue with prevention and how we really capture that. I know the administration's tried very hard to get, at least the First Lady has tried very hard to get a lot of efforts started with regards to obesity and exercise and really starting these trends early on in life, whether it's diet, exercise, staying away from tobacco, et cetera. So a big part of, Dr. Collins can talk about the genomes and all these things that just make most of us confused. At the end of the day, we put on a seatbelt when we get in the car. I put on a helmet when I get on my bike. You don't smoke cigarettes. These are the simple things that we can't forget about either in our society. That, by the way, don't cost anything.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry I forgot last time. Meredith Wadman with Nature. You're saying no cuts. Do you have a budget figure you're saying instead please implement this level of funding for NIH or for NCI in 2012 or even in the remainder of 2011?
Well, I would say that I think we would associate ourselves with the budget that was submitted by the administration. In this area, that's really, we think, the appropriate number. Any other questions? Anybody on the phone? No? Thank you all for joining us today.